Close your eyes and imagine a king sitting on his throne, golden crown on his head, silk robes flowing down, and a hall filled with the smell of incense and wine. Now, take a step closer. The truth was not as glamorous. Behind the walls of these great castles, filth ruled. Royalty in the Middle Ages lived lives full of power and luxury, yes, but also of dirt, disease, and habits so shocking that modern people would find them unbearable. In this video, we are going to uncover the dirtiest habits of medieval royalty. From rotten teeth to castles crawling with lice, from foul-smelling banquet halls to kings who avoided bathing for years, this is the darker, grittier, and smellier side of history. So, sit back, relax, and let us journey into a time when the crown may have shone brightly, but the king beneath it often stank.
Castles are often painted as places of beauty, grand towers touching the skies, glittering halls filled with music and dance. But step inside one during the Middle Ages, and your nose would be assaulted before your eyes even adjusted to the dim light. Why? Because medieval castles stank. Unlike the palaces of later centuries, there were no proper sewage systems. Instead, chamber pots, small portable toilets, were used by everyone, including the king and queen. And what happened to the waste? Often, it was simply dumped out of the nearest window. Imagine walking through the courtyard only to have a servant casually toss out the contents of the royal chamber pot above you. This was daily life. The stench didn't end there. Many castles had moats, but instead of being filled with clean water, they were often polluted with sewage and trash. In summer, when the sun beat down, the smell grew unbearable. Even inside the king's private chamber, things were not much better. A servant known as the groom of the stool, yes, that was the official title, was tasked with managing the king's toilet needs. It sounds humiliating, but believe it or not, it was considered one of the most prestigious positions in court because of the king's trust. Imagine it, the most powerful man in the land, surrounded by gold and velvet, yet still relying on another man to help him with something as basic as relieving himself. Foreign visitors to medieval courts often wrote about the shocking smells of royal castles. One even described the Palace of Versailles during Louis XIV's reign as so foul that courtiers would faint from the stench of unwashed nobles and overflowing chamber pots. And remember, Versailles was considered one of the most magnificent royal residences in the world. If that palace was foul, just imagine the condition of earlier, darker castles of the Middle Ages. The truth is, medieval royalty lived with smells that we today would find intolerable. They masked it with perfumes, flowers, and incense, but the stink always returned. Behind the glamour of the throne room, the real scent of royalty was not gold and roses, but sweat, waste, and rot.
Today, we think of bathing as refreshing, healthy, and essential for staying clean. But in the Middle Ages, even kings and queens feared the water. The belief at the time was that water opened the pores of the skin, allowing diseases to enter the body. Instead of cleansing, many people thought bathing made you weak and vulnerable. And so, even royalty, those with the most wealth and power, avoided it. It may shock you to hear this, but some kings were rumored to bathe only a few times a year. For example, King Louis XIV of France, one of the most powerful monarchs in history, reportedly hated bathing and did it only when doctors insisted. Instead of washing, nobles preferred what they called dry cleaning. No, not the kind we know today, but wiping themselves with cloths soaked in vinegar, rosewater, or herbs. This was their version of staying fresh. Imagine Queen Elizabeth I of England, known as the Virgin Queen, dressed in magnificent gowns of silk and lace, admired across Europe. And yet, It is said she bathed only a handful of times in her entire life. Instead, she relied on perfumes and scented powders to mask the odor of her unwashed body. Perfume became an essential part of royal life. In fact, some nobles carried small bags of herbs or flowers, called posies, to sniff whenever the smells around them became too overwhelming. Bathhouses did exist in medieval Europe, and in some cities they were quite popular. But they gained a bad reputation, often associated with immorality, gambling, and even brothels. Because of this, many royals and nobles avoided them, believing they were both dangerous to health and damaging to reputation. Instead, strange rituals took their place. Some royals would sit in hot rooms filled with herbs and steam, sweating out what they believed were bad humors. Others would rub their skin with cloths soaked in wine or even milk, thinking it purified the body. There are records of noble women bathing in donkey's milk, goat's milk, or even rose water. It was more about luxury and appearance than hygiene. But no matter how many perfumes or herbal cloths they used, nothing could truly replace soap and water. Visitors to medieval courts often remarked on the overpowering body odors of royalty. The clothes might have sparkled, the crowns might have shone, but the air around them was heavy with the smell of sweat and dirt. So while kings and queens lived in castles of stone and dressed in jewels, their bodies told another story. A story of fear. Fear of bathing, fear of water, and fear of the very thing that could have saved them from disease. In the Middle Ages, the dirtiest habit wasn't just how little they washed, it was that they believed staying dirty was safer than being clean.
When we imagine kings and queens, we think of perfect smiles in portraits, gleaming crowns, sparkling jewels, and dignified faces. But behind those painted smiles often hid a terrible secret: rotten teeth and foul breath. You see, sugar was one of the most prized luxuries of the medieval world. It was imported at great cost from faraway lands, and only the wealthy, especially royalty, could afford it, and they loved it. Sweet cakes, candied fruits, sugared wine, royals consumed sugar with abandon, never realizing the damage it was causing. Unlike today, there were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no dentists as we know them. At best, people might chew on twigs, rub their teeth with rough cloths, or use ashes and crushed herbs to scrape away food. But this did little to protect them. The result? Blackened, decayed teeth were a common sight among nobles. Queen Elizabeth I of England, despite her power and glory, was infamous for her teeth. In her later years, her mouth was said to be so decayed that she struggled to speak clearly. Foreign ambassadors wrote that her smile was darkened and her breath was unbearable. Kings were no better. Henry III of France was so fond of sweet preserves that by the time he was older, he had almost no healthy teeth left. Dining with him was said to be a challenge, not just because of his political power, but because of the smell that came whenever he opened his mouth. But here's the strangest part. In some courts, black teeth became a sign of wealth. Because only the rich could afford sugar, having darkened or rotten teeth was, in a twisted way, a status symbol. Poor peasants, who rarely had sugar, often had healthier mouths than their rulers. To mask the stench of bad breath, royals chewed cloves, cinnamon, or mint leaves. Some rinsed their mouths with wine or vinegar, believing it kept the teeth strong. Others simply ignored it, expecting their servants and courtiers to endure the smell in silence. Imagine sitting at a royal banquet, the king beside you gnawing on a leg of roasted meat, bits of food sticking to blackened teeth, while the sour smell of decay filled the air. This was not the elegance of modern royalty. It was the reality of medieval dining. Dentistry, when attempted, was brutal. Rotten teeth were sometimes yanked out with pliers without pain relief,
leaving royals disfigured or in agony. Some wore false teeth, carved from animal bones or ivory, but these were uncomfortable and often made things worse. So when you see portraits of smiling monarchs, remember, behind the paintbrush's flattering strokes may have been mouths filled with decay. The jewels on their crowns sparkled, but the smell of their breath could clear a room.
When we picture a royal feast, it's easy to imagine long tables covered in golden plates, delicate silver goblets, and fine manners. But the truth is very different. In the Middle Ages, dining at a king's table was messy, greasy, and shockingly animal-like. For one thing, forks were not common. In fact, for centuries, using a fork was considered strange. Some even thought it was sinful, a sign of vanity. So kings and queens, along with their nobles, ate mostly with their hands. Picture this, a lavish banquet hall lit by torches and candles, tables piled high with roasted boar, venison, geese, pies, and puddings. Now imagine dozens of noblemen and women tearing at the food with bare fingers, grease dripping down their sleeves, licking their hands before reaching for more. Servants would carry in trays of food, but there were no individual plates. Instead, people shared trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as makeshift plates. Once soaked with grease and sauce, these trenchers were thrown to the dogs waiting under the table, or given to beggars after the feast. The smell inside the hall was overwhelming. Roasted meat, spilled wine, sweat from packed bodies, and the stink of dogs scrounging underfoot. Table manners were shockingly crude. Burping was not considered rude. It was expected, even polite, as a sign that you enjoyed the meal. Nobles spat bones and gristle onto the floor, wiped greasy fingers on the tablecloth, or sometimes on their servants' clothing. Henry VIII of England was notorious for his feasting. He consumed vast amounts of meat daily, washed down with strong ale and wine. Chroniclers wrote that he often left the table covered in grease, belching loudly, while musicians played to drown out the chaos of the feast. Even the drinks were unsafe. Water was often contaminated, so everyone, even children, drank ale or watered-down wine. This meant drunkenness at the table was common, and disorderly behavior often followed. Foreign visitors were sometimes horrified. One Italian diplomat described an English banquet where nobles behaved, in his words, like hungry wolves, with little grace and much noise. And while the nobility gorged themselves, the servants and common folk who prepared the meals often survived on scraps or nothing at all. The contrast was stark. Kings sat on golden chairs, tearing at greasy meat with their bare hands, while peasants starved outside the castle gates. So the next time you imagine a medieval banquet, forget the fairy tales of elegance and refinement. Instead, imagine chaos, hands tearing, mouths chomping, dogs growling for scraps, and a hall echoing with belches and drunken laughter. The table of a medieval king was not just a symbol of wealth, it was also a theater of gluttony, waste, and filth.
When you think of a king's chamber, you probably imagine silk sheets, golden candelabras, and luxury beyond measure. But there were other residents in those castles, uninvited guests that even the mightiest kings and queens could not keep away. Rats, lice, fleas. Yes, even in royal bedrooms, vermin were a constant reality. Castles were built strong against armies, but they were terrible against dirt. The stone walls were cold and damp, the wooden floors were rarely cleaned, and food scraps from endless banquets attracted pests of every kind. Rats scurried through kitchens and cellars, stealing bread and gnawing at cheese. They made nests in straw mattresses, even in the chambers of royalty. Servants often reported seeing rats crawl across floors at night, sometimes even climbing onto the royal beds. Lice were so common that even kings were seen scratching their scalps during meetings of state. Noblewomen, with their elaborate hairstyles, often carried combs decorated with jewels, but these were not just for beauty. They were used to remove lice and fleas hiding in their hair. Fleas, in particular, were everywhere. Courtiers would sometimes sit and idly catch them during long meetings, crushing them between fingernails. For them, it was an annoyance. For us today, it would be horrifying. But fleas carried a far greater danger. In the 14th century, they spread one of the deadliest plagues in history, the Black Death. It swept through Europe, killing millions, and no castle walls could keep it out. Kings and queens, despite all their wealth, were just as vulnerable as peasants. Some monarchs fled their palaces in terror, believing fresh air in the countryside would save them. Yet even after the plague passed, vermin remained daily companions of the royal court. One chronicler described the French royal palace as crawling with mice and rats, even as nobles danced in golden halls. Another account tells of nobles scratching so furiously at fleas that formal meetings had to be paused. It's strange to think the most powerful rulers of medieval Europe, commanding armies and controlling nations, could not control the tiny creatures biting them in their sleep. So, while portraits show kings and queens in splendor, the unseen truth was far less regal. Beneath the velvet robes and golden crowns, their bodies itched, their beds crawled, and their castles echoed with the scratching and squeaking of vermin. Power may have kept armies at bay, but it did little against lice and fleas.
When we imagine royalty, we picture golden thrones. But there was another throne, far less glamorous, that every king and queen had to use. Yes, even kings had to go to the toilet. But in the Middle Ages, their toilets were nothing like ours today. Inside castles, the most common toilet was the garderobe. It was little more than a hole carved into the wall of the tower. Waste would fall straight down into a pit below, or, even worse, into the moat surrounding the castle. Can you imagine the smell in the summer sun when the moat, filled with sewage, began to rot? Servants complained of swarms of insects rising from the castle ditches, carrying disease back inside the walls. And these garderobes had no privacy. They were cold, drafty, and often exposed to the wind. Using one at night, in darkness, must have been a miserable experience, even for a king. But royalty did not always use the garderobe. In their chambers, they relied on chamber pots, simple bowls or buckets kept by the bed. Servants would then carry these away each morning, emptying them wherever they could. And here is one of the strangest facts in royal history. The most prestigious servant in the king's household was the groom of the stool. His duty? To assist the king with his toilet needs and to make sure the royal bowels were comfortable and cared for. As humiliating as it sounds, this was a position of great trust. The groom of the stool had daily private access to the king. He often became one of the king's closest advisors, not because of his wisdom, but because of his role in such a personal part of the king's life. Historians record that King Henry VIII had several grooms of the stool who became incredibly powerful at court. Their influence came from being with the king during his most private and vulnerable moments. Still, no amount of ceremony could hide the truth. Castles stank of human waste. Even with herbs scattered on floors and perfumes burning in halls, the foul odor of cesspits, garderobes, and chamber pots could not be covered. So while kings sat proudly on their golden thrones in public, in private, they sat on very different thrones, ones that reminded everyone, no matter how rich or powerful, that royalty was still human. But in the Middle Ages, even the act of using the toilet became part of royal ritual,
and part of the dirty truth of life in a castle. When you think of royalty, you imagine glittering gowns, velvet cloaks, and robes trimmed with gold and fur. And it's true, medieval kings and queens loved their fashion. But here's the part history often leaves out. Those clothes were rarely, if ever, washed. In the Middle Ages, laundering clothes was difficult, expensive, and sometimes even considered dangerous. Many nobles believed that washing fabric too often would damage it, or that water itself could bring illness. So instead of cleaning their clothes, royals often wore the same garments again and again until they were filthy. Heavy gowns and cloaks, layered over undergarments, trapped sweat and dirt. Summer heat made it worse, soaking the fine silks with the smell of the body beneath. But instead of washing, nobles relied on perfumes, herbs, and scented oils to mask the odor. Servants might brush the clothes to remove surface dirt or sprinkle them with crushed flowers to hide stains. But real washing? That was rare. Undergarments were supposed to be changed more often, but even these were sometimes worn for weeks. One royal wardrobe account shows a king receiving dozens of new shirts each year, not because they were washed, but because they were simply replaced. For the very wealthy, fashion itself was more important than cleanliness. To own many outfits, even if they were dirty, was a symbol of status. A nobleman wearing a gown stained with grease or spotted with sweat could still be admired if it was trimmed with ermine fur. Meanwhile, those closest to royalty knew the truth. Servants complained of the lice that hid in seams and furs. Chroniclers wrote about the overpowering smell that clung to nobles in crowded halls. There's even a saying from the time, "Better to smell of wealth than of soap." Soap was for commoners. Perfume, silks, and fur were for kings and queens, even if the stench beneath was unbearable. Imagine attending a royal ball. The gowns shimmer under candlelight, jewels sparkle, music plays, yet the air is thick, heavy with perfume trying to cover sweat, grease, and dirt. Nobles dance, smiling, their unwashed clothes rustling against one another. From a distance, it looks like a dream. Up close, it would smell more like a nightmare. So while portraits show kings and queens wrapped in luxury, the reality was far less elegant. The robes of medieval royalty were beautiful to the eye, but filthy to the touch.
History books often speak of royal marriages, alliances, and dynasties, but behind the polished words of politics lay a world of lust, affairs, and unclean secrets. Medieval kings and queens were not always faithful. In fact, many rulers kept mistresses, lovers, and secret partners hidden within their castles. But remember, this was an age without modern hygiene. Affairs were not just scandalous, they were often downright filthy. Imagine a royal chamber lit by candles. A king sneaks through the corridors to meet his mistress. The room is perfumed with incense, but beneath it lingers the smell of unwashed bodies, dirty sheets, and the rot of a castle that rarely saw soap. Henry VIII of England, famous for his 6 wives, was also rumored to have countless mistresses. Chroniclers wrote that he was so indulgent in food, drink, and women that his body suffered from sores, foul breath, and disease. Yet he continued his pursuits, spreading rumors and scandals throughout his court. Affairs were not just private matters, they shaped politics. A mistress could influence a king's decisions, whispering in his ear during moments of intimacy. Queens, too, sometimes took lovers when their husbands strayed. But secrecy was dangerous. A discovered affair could mean imprisonment, humiliation, or even death.
And then there were the consequences. Sexually transmitted diseases spread through courts, often disguised under vague terms like the French disease or the Great Pox. Many historians believe syphilis ravaged the nobility of Europe during the late Middle Ages, leaving disfigurement, madness, and death in its path. But even without disease, the practices themselves were shocking. Bathing before intimacy was rare. Perfume, herbs, and scented oils were used to cover odors. Some believed eating certain foods like onions, garlic, or exotic spices could act as aphrodisiacs, though they only made the stench worse. One chronicler described a king who kept multiple mistresses in separate wings of his castle, each chamber filled with perfumes, flowers, and silks. Yet, behind the glamour, the reality was sweaty sheets, fleas, and sickness. And perhaps most disturbing of all, some royals considered lust a natural right of kingship. They believed their position gave them license to take lovers at will, even if it meant scandal, disease, or heartbreak. So while poets sang of courtly love and knights vowed loyalty to fair ladies, the truth inside the castle walls was far different. It was a world of whispered secrets, dangerous liaisons, and passions hidden beneath the stench of unwashed flesh and dirty linens. The crowns sparkled, the scandals burned, and the filth lingered.
In the medieval world, medicine and hygiene were often guided less by science and more by superstition, religion, and old wives' tales. Royalty, despite their wealth and power, were not spared from the bizarre and filthy treatments of the age. Doctors, or more accurately, physicians and barber surgeons, believed the body was controlled by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If a king or queen fell ill, treatment often meant balancing these humors in ways that today sound horrifying. One common method was bloodletting. Doctors would cut a vein or apply leeches, allowing blood to flow out in hopes of restoring balance. Royal children, noblemen, and even queens were bled regularly. Sometimes the patient was already weak, and the bloodletting only hastened death. Another popular remedy was urine. Physicians examined its color, smell, and even taste to diagnose illness. Some treatments even involved drinking it. Yes, even royalty sometimes consumed their own urine, believing it held healing powers. Dung was also a common ingredient. Manuals from the time suggested applying animal droppings to wounds to draw out poison. In some cases, cow dung was mixed with herbs and applied as a poultice. Instead of curing infection, it often worsened it. Perfumes and incense were also considered medicinal. A king might sit in a chamber filled with burning herbs, not only to mask foul odors, but to ward off what they called bad air. They believed disease spread through miasma, the stench of rot and filth, so covering it with stronger smells was thought to be protective. Even bathing, when it was done, was often prescribed as a cure, but doctors warned that water opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease. So instead of washing away dirt, many nobles smeared themselves with oils or powders to seal the skin. Perhaps the most shocking of all was the belief in touching or wearing holy relics for healing. A sick king might clutch the bones of a saint, or a queen might wear a charm made from ground-up gemstones. These relics, though sacred, offered no real cure, yet they were trusted more than any soap or clean water. And yet in this strange world, some practices did have merit. Honey, often used as a salve, truly does have antibacterial properties. Herbal teas sometimes eased fevers or stomach pains.
But for every useful remedy, there were dozens that only spread infection, deepened sickness, or left scars. Imagine a royal chamber where a physician prepares a mixture of crushed herbs, dung, and animal fat to apply on a wound while chanting prayers to balance the humors. The king, desperate for relief, submits. His chamber reeks, the wound festers, and the cycle of filth continues. So while medieval medicine claimed to protect royalty, it often trapped them in a cycle of superstition, dirt, and disease. The crown offered no shield against ignorance.
When we picture a royal banquet, the mind fills with visions of glittering halls, golden goblets, roasted meats, and music echoing through stone walls. And yes, medieval kings and queens loved to host enormous feasts, sometimes lasting days. But the reality of these banquets was far dirtier than the paintings suggest. A royal hall would be packed with nobles, courtiers, servants, and musicians. Long wooden tables overflowed with roasted boars, pies stuffed with pigeons, whole deer, and even peacocks served with their feathers still attached for decoration. The smell was overwhelming. Rich meats, spices, wine, mixed with sweat, unwashed clothes, and smoke from dozens of candles and torches. Forks were rare and often considered unnecessary or even effeminate. Guests ate with their hands, tearing meat apart and licking their fingers clean. Bread was used as a plate. Thick slices called trenchers soaked up grease and sauces. When finished, the bread wasn't eaten by the nobles, it was thrown to servants, dogs, or the poor waiting outside. But here's the dirty secret. Hygiene at these feasts was nearly non-existent. Washing hands before eating was optional and often just a quick dip in a communal basin of water that grew filthier with every guest. Shared cups passed from person to person, spreading disease. Bones, shells, and scraps were tossed directly onto the floor. Servants walked through the mess, stepping on half-eaten food, broken trenchers, and spilled wine. Rats and dogs roamed freely under the tables, snatching whatever they could. And let's not forget the toilets, or lack thereof. Many feasting halls had no proper latrines nearby. Guests might excuse themselves to a corner, a bucket, or even step outside into the castle yard. The stench sometimes drifted back into the feast. Even the food itself could be dangerous. Preservation methods were primitive: salt, smoke, or vinegar. Spoiled meat was often disguised with heavy spices or sauces. What looked like a feast fit for a king might actually be rotten beneath the surface. Royal banquets were not only dirty, they were also wasteful. While nobles stuffed themselves with more food than they could ever finish, peasants outside starved. Chronicles describe tables so full that food collapsed onto the ground where servants trampled it. And yet, in the eyes of the court, this chaos was a sign of power. A king who could afford such excess, even if it rotted, showed his wealth and dominance. A queen dripping with jewels as she tore into greasy meat was proof of her station. So, while medieval art shows elegant nobles sipping from jeweled cups, the truth is far less graceful. Picture greasy fingers wiping on velvet sleeves, wine-stained mouths, scraps crunching underfoot, and the sour smell of waste creeping through the hall.
After long days of ruling, feasting, or indulging in courtly pleasures, kings and queens retired to their chambers. And while the royal bed is often imagined as a place of luxury, massive, draped in silks and surrounded by attendants, the truth is far less comfortable and far more disgusting. Royal beds were indeed enormous. A king might sleep in a bed wide enough for 4 or 5 people, decorated with carved wood, velvet curtains, and embroidered sheets. But beneath the grandeur lurked filth. Lice and fleas infested even the richest bedding. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool, but rarely cleaned. Over time, they became damp, moldy, and crawling with vermin. Sheets were washed infrequently, sometimes only a few times per year. Instead, servants simply shook them out or sprinkled herbs to mask the smell. Bedbugs were a constant plague. Chronicles mention queens scratching themselves raw at night, or kings waking covered in bites. And since heating was poor, nobles often slept under layers of heavy blankets and furs. Warm, yes, but also perfect hiding spots for pests. Privacy was another problem. A royal bedroom was rarely private in the way we imagine today. Attendants slept nearby, sometimes even in the same room, ready to serve at a moment's notice. Courtiers might gather in a royal bedroom for morning audiences, discussions, or even meals. Imagine the stench: dozens of bodies, stale air, smoke from candles, and unwashed fabrics. Even intimacy was rarely private. When a king and queen shared their bed, witnesses were often present to confirm that the marriage was consummated, especially when heirs were at stake. The most personal moments of royal life unfolded under the watch of others, in rooms filled with lice and the smell of unwashed bedding. Some monarchs tried to fight this filth with perfumes, fresh flowers, and finely embroidered linens. Yet even the most beautiful fabrics could not keep away the pests. Accounts tell us that when one French king traveled, his servants carried his entire bed with him, hoping to avoid infestations in foreign castles. Of course, the vermin simply traveled along. And while beds were symbols of power, often passed down as heirlooms, the reality of sleeping in them was far from regal. A crown may have glittered on the head of a king, but beneath the blankets, he scratched at bites, tossed on lumpy straw, and breathed in the stench of centuries-old fabrics. So the royal bed was not the paradise we imagine. It was grand to look at, yes, but it was crawling, itchy, and filthy to sleep in.
Behind every glittering banquet, beyond the candlelit halls where nobles feasted, there was another world, the royal kitchen. And while kitchens today are places of cleanliness and order, the medieval royal kitchen was a chaotic, filthy, and sometimes revolting place. Royal kitchens were massive. In great castles, they could employ dozens or even hundreds of workers: cooks, spit-turners, butchers, bakers, and servants. Fires burned constantly, filling the air with smoke. Huge cauldrons bubbled with stews, and spits groaned under the weight of whole oxen or deer. But hygiene was an afterthought. Water for cooking often came from nearby rivers or wells, sources that were polluted with human waste, animal dung, or rotting garbage. Food was placed on wooden tables where blood and grease soaked into the surface. Knives and tools were rarely washed. Animals destined for the table were sometimes kept in pens inside the castle itself. Chickens, pigs, and even cows lived in the courtyards or near the kitchens, leaving behind filth and a constant stench. Vermin, rats, mice, cockroaches, were everywhere, feasting on scraps that fell to the floor. The sheer volume of food made things worse. A royal feast might require hundreds of dishes, all prepared at once. In the rush, spoiled meat was covered with heavy sauces or spices to disguise the taste. Fish that had been sitting for days was drenched in vinegar. Bread baked from old flour carried mold. The nobles ate extravagantly, but often at great risk. For the lowest servants, life in the kitchen was brutal. Spitboys, usually children, worked for hours turning heavy roasting spits by hand. The heat was unbearable, and burns were common.
Grease and ash coated their bodies, the stench of sweat mixed with the reek of raw meat and smoke. And let's not forget the waste. Buckets of entrails, bones, and scraps piled up daily. Some were tossed to the dogs, others thrown into castle moats or ditches where they rotted in the sun. The smell of the kitchen was so strong it often carried into the great hall itself. Even the plates nobles ate from weren't always clean. Wooden trenchers were scraped and reused. Metal dishes were wiped but not properly washed. Shared drinking cups passed germs from one noble's mouth to another. Yet, despite the filth, the royal kitchen was a place of pride. Cooks developed elaborate recipes. Peacocks roasted and redressed in their feathers, pies filled with live birds that flew out when cut, and jelly shaped into castles or crowns. The spectacle distracted guests from the dirt behind the scenes. So, while nobles marveled at the wonders brought to their tables, only the servants knew the truth, that every dish carried the taste of sweat, smoke, and squalor. The royal kitchen was not the heart of refinement, it was the heart of filth, hidden just beyond the banquet doors.
When you picture a medieval king or queen, you probably imagine elegance. Perfectly styled hair, shimmering jewels, smooth skin, and powdered faces. But beneath the illusion of beauty lay some of the dirtiest and most dangerous habits of the age. Personal grooming in the Middle Ages was primitive at best. Soap was rare and expensive. Many nobles simply wiped their faces with cloths dipped in rosewater or vinegar instead of washing properly. Hair was combed, but lice were a constant problem. Servants spent hours picking through a king's or queen's hair, crushing lice with their nails or combs made of bone. Cosmetics were meant to cover filth, not remove it. Pale skin was the ultimate mark of nobility, a sign that one did not labor under the sun. To achieve this, queens and noblewomen smeared their faces with mixtures of lead powder, vinegar, and egg whites. The result was a ghostly, smooth complexion, but also poisoning. Over time, the lead ate into their skin, caused hair loss, and left many with rotting teeth and sores. Rouge was applied to the cheeks, made from crushed berries or sometimes even mercury-based compounds. Eyebrows were darkened with soot. Perfumed oils were dabbed on the skin to mask odors, but these often mixed with sweat, creating an even heavier stench. Men had their own grooming habits. Beards were often trimmed by barbers, who also acted as surgeons, cutting hair one day and bloodletting the next. A king might have his beard oiled and perfumed, but lice still crawled in his whiskers. Dental care was almost non-existent. Some royals chewed herbs to freshen their breath, but bad teeth and foul odors were common. Perfumed gloves became popular not only as fashion, but also as a way to hide the smell of one's own hands. Bathing rituals, when they happened, were more for display than cleanliness. Queens might sit in ornate tubs filled with scented water while courtiers looked on. But instead of soap, the water was filled with herbs and oils that left the dirt clinging beneath the perfume. And perhaps the strangest beauty ritual of all was hair removal. Some noblewomen plucked their hairlines back to create a high forehead, considered fashionable at the time. Others removed eyebrows entirely, leaving their faces pale, bare, and unnatural. But no matter the effort, the truth could not be fully hidden. Chroniclers often remarked that even the most beautiful queens had breath so foul it cleared a room, or skin so coated in makeup it cracked under candlelight. So the royal face was not the flawless image painted in portraits. It was a mask, powdered with poison, smeared with filth, and crawling with pests. Beauty in the Middle Ages was less about cleanliness and more about hiding the dirt beneath.
Royalty in the Middle Ages loved their animals. Dogs, cats, birds, and even exotic beasts filled their castles. Pets were symbols of wealth and status, proof that a king or queen could afford luxuries beyond the reach of ordinary people. But as charming as these companions were, they added yet another layer of filth to already dirty royal lives. Dogs were the most common pets. Nobles kept sleek hunting hounds, as well as lapdogs that followed queens through their chambers. But these animals weren't house-trained in the modern sense. They often relieved themselves on floors and corners, or even on royal beds. Servants cleaned what they could, but the smells lingered. Cats prowled castles, sometimes treated as pets, sometimes tolerated as mousers. While they helped control vermin, they also carried fleas and left behind messes of their own. Some royals adored their cats. Others despised them, linking them to witchcraft. Birds were popular too. Falcons were kept for hunting, while parrots and songbirds entertained the court with their colors and voices. But imagine the noise and droppings of dozens of birds inside a stone hall. The air, already heavy with human odors, filled with feathers and the sour stench of bird waste. The wealthiest monarchs flaunted exotic animals. Monkeys, lions, leopards, and even elephants were gifted as symbols of power. Henry III of England famously kept a polar bear in the Tower of London, which swam in the Thames. But exotic animals came with exotic filth. They were poorly fed, rarely cleaned, and often left to foul the courtyards. Pets also shared in the filth of daily life. Lapdogs slept in beds with queens, carrying fleas and ticks. Monkeys, though amusing, were notorious for biting, stealing food, and spreading disease. Servants often grumbled about the endless task of cleaning up after the animals that nobles adored. Yet pets were also political. A noblewoman might gift a lapdog to another lady as a sign of friendship. Kings used falcons as prized diplomatic gifts. To refuse an animal could be an insult, even if it meant welcoming more filth into one's court. So, despite the chaos, pets played an important role in the daily lives of royals. They offered companionship in lonely castles, amusement in long winters, and symbols of majesty to impress visiting guests. But beneath the symbolism lay dirt, noise, and disease. A royal chamber might glitter with gold and silk, but on the floor, dogs barked, cats scratched, and birds squawked, leaving their mess wherever they pleased. So, while portraits show kings and queens with elegant pets by their side, the reality was less refined. Royalty did not just live among jewels and crowns. They lived among droppings, fleas, and the wild stink of their beloved animals.
When a king or queen died in the Middle Ages, it was not just a moment of mourning. It was a crisis. The death of a monarch threatened power, stability, and succession. But before politics came another urgent problem: the body itself. Medieval embalming techniques were primitive, and bodies began to decompose quickly. Royalty often died in hot, crowded castles where air was already thick with odors of sweat, waste, and smoke. Within hours, the body began to smell. To slow the decay, some monarchs were embalmed, but the process was crude. Organs were removed and buried separately. The body was stuffed with herbs, spices, or even sawdust to keep its shape. In some cases, honey or wine was poured into the coffin to preserve the corpse. But these methods rarely worked for long. Chroniclers describe horrific scenes. One French king's body, placed in a lead coffin, swelled until the casket burst open in the heat, releasing a stench so strong it cleared the church. Another monarch's funeral procession had to be cut short because the smell of decay was unbearable to the mourners. Funerals themselves were grand but messy affairs. Bodies were dressed in fine robes, crowns placed upon their heads, and laid in open caskets for days of viewing. Mourners filed past, some fainting from the odor. Incense burned constantly, not only as a religious ritual, but as a desperate attempt to mask the smell of rot. Sometimes, multiple ceremonies were held in different cities. To transport the corpse, it was wrapped in cloths soaked with vinegar or tar. But long journeys often meant that by the time the body arrived, it was already falling apart. Servants traveling with royal remains endured nightmarish conditions: sour air, leaking coffins, and the endless task of keeping vermin away. Even after burial, filth lingered. Royal tombs were not always sealed well. Insects and rats sometimes invaded crypts. In wars, tombs were looted, bodies disturbed, bones scattered. The dignity of royal death often gave way to grim realities of dirt and decay. Yet for all this filth, funerals were spectacles of power. Thousands gathered, banners flew, bells rang, and churches overflowed. The body, no matter how foul, was the center of attention. Kings and queens were honored as saints, even as their corpses rotted before the crowd. Imagine the contradiction: golden crowns, incense clouds, chanting monks, weeping courtiers, all surrounding a body that reeked of death and decay. It was majesty and filth side by side. So the medieval royal funeral was not the clean, solemn affair we might imagine. It was a mix of grandeur and grotesque, a reminder that even the greatest kings and queens could not escape the dirt of death.
Medieval royalty did not just rule with crowns and swords, they also ruled with superstition. Behind every decision, every ritual, and every act of daily life, there were strange beliefs meant to ward off sickness, attract luck, or secure power. Many of these rituals were not only bizarre, but filthy. One common superstition was the power of touch. Kings were believed to have the divine ability to heal the sick. Monarchs across Europe performed the royal touch, laying hands on people suffering from scrofula, a disease of swollen glands. But with no real cure, all the king spread was germs from one unwashed hand to another. Blood was also central to royal superstition. Some rulers drank small amounts of blood, believing it gave them strength or vitality. Others bathed in it. Legends claimed that certain queens used the blood of animals, and in darker rumors, even that of virgins to preserve youth. While many of these tales are exaggerated, the fascination with blood as a mystical substance was very real. Charms and amulets were another obsession. Kings and queens wore talismans filled with herbs, bones, or even pieces of mummified flesh. These were thought to protect against plague, curses, and evil spirits. But in reality, they only spread foul smells and carried disease. Astrology guided royal decisions as well. Before battles, marriages, or even baths, monarchs often consulted astrologers. A king might refuse to wash or eat on a certain day because the stars were in the wrong alignment. Dirty clothes, filthy chambers, or skipped meals were justified by superstition. Rituals of purification often made matters worse. Some nobles burned foul-smelling herbs like sulfur or dung to cleanse the air. Instead of freshening the room, they filled it with choking smoke. Others believed rubbing raw animal fat on the skin would protect against cold or evil spirits. The result? A stinking, greasy mess. Religious rituals could also be extreme. Some monarchs whipped themselves as penance, sweating and bleeding into dirty clothes that were never properly cleaned. Pilgrimages left kings and queens trudging along muddy roads, sleeping in flea-ridden inns, and carrying filth back to their castles. Perhaps the most shocking ritual was tied to death. It was believed that touching or even eating parts of a saint's body could heal the living. Royals sometimes consumed powders made from ground bones or drank liquids infused with holy relics. To them, this was sacred. To us, it is unthinkably dirty. In every castle, superstition filled the air as much as smoke or perfume. The most powerful men and women in Europe, draped in gold and velvet, still clung to charms, rituals, and filthy practices to protect themselves from forces they barely understood. So, while portraits show wise, majestic rulers, the truth
is stranger. Behind the crown was a man or woman carrying amulets, rubbing strange oils, and performing rituals with blood, bones, and filth, all in the desperate hope of surviving a dangerous world.
Filthy travel, roads, inns, and royal journeys. When we picture a royal journey, we often imagine golden carriages, shining horses, and cheering crowds. But in reality, travel for kings and queens during the Middle Ages was anything but glamorous. It was filthy, exhausting, and often dangerous. First, the roads. Medieval roads were rarely paved. Most were nothing more than dirt paths, turning into rivers of mud in the rain and choking clouds of dust in the summer. Carriages got stuck, horses broke legs, and travelers were splattered with filth from head to toe. Even royalty could not escape it. Their silk robes, shoes, and banners were often coated in mud and animal waste before the day's journey was done. Then there were the inns. Castles were few and far between, so even monarchs had to stay in local inns or manor houses while traveling. These inns were overcrowded, smoky, and crawling with fleas. Beds were often shared, sheets rarely washed, and chamber pots overflowed in corners. A king might arrive expecting hospitality, and instead be greeted by moldy bread, sour wine, and straw infested with vermin. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Animals roamed freely in courtyards, leaving waste everywhere. Water was often drawn from the same source used to dump sewage. Even royal attendants fell ill after drinking contaminated water on the road. Travel was also slow and dangerous. A royal caravan included wagons of food, tents, servants, guards, and baggage. Progress was measured in miles per day, not per hour. When it rained, carts sank into the mud, forcing men to dig them out. When it was dry, dust coated clothes, skin, and lungs until everyone in the procession coughed. The filth wasn't limited to the outdoors. Royal carriages, though decorated, were cramped and suffocating. Upholstery was rarely cleaned, and the smell of sweat, perfume, leather, and unwashed bodies filled the air. A long ride in such a carriage left passengers sore, sweaty, and stinking. Even the act of eating on the road was grim. Food spoiled quickly, so travelers often dined on salted meat, hard bread, and sour ale. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare. Royalty sometimes brought their own cooks, but even they could only do so much with spoiled supplies. Flies swarmed over everything, and hand-washing before meals was nearly impossible. Bandits and ambushes added to the misery. Traveling with treasure, royal banners, and gold meant every journey attracted danger. Guards were essential, but they also added more mouths to feed, more horses to stable, and more waste to manage along the route. The contrast was staggering. On one hand, processions displayed banners, trumpets, and golden symbols of majesty. On the other, behind the pageantry, servants dumped chamber pots in ditches. Soldiers stank of sweat and armor rust, and the king himself might be sitting in a carriage filled with fleas. In the end, medieval royal travel was a paradox, a spectacle of power wrapped in mud, hunger, and stench. For every cheering villager, there was a servant knee-deep in filth, struggling to keep the royal party moving. So while paintings show kings and queens riding in glory, the reality was far dirtier. To travel in the Middle Ages was to suffer discomfort, disease, and grime, even if you wore a crown.
In the Middle Ages, medicine was as much guesswork as science, and even the most powerful kings and queens were not spared from filthy, dangerous, and downright bizarre treatments. Being royal meant you had the best doctors of your time, but that did not always mean the best medicine. Doctors of the court often believed in the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile.
Health, they claimed, depended on balancing these fluids. But their methods of balance were usually harmful. If a king had a fever, he was bled with leeches or cut with knives until he grew weak. If a queen suffered headaches, she might be given purges or enemas made from rancid oils and herbs. Hygiene was rarely part of treatment. Instruments were not sterilized, and wounds were touched with dirty hands. Many patients left treatment sicker than before. Yet monarchs trusted their physicians, believing them to be guided by divine wisdom or astrology. Some of the remedies were downright filthy. Powdered animal dung was used for wounds. Ground-up worms, crushed insects, and moldy bread were applied to sores. Boiled urine was prescribed as a drink to cure infections. In desperate times, nothing was considered too disgusting to try. Royal childbirth was especially dangerous. Queens often gave birth in unsanitary chambers filled with incense smoke, but little ventilation. Midwives used unwashed cloths, and instruments carried disease from one mother to another. Many royal infants died within days, not from curses or evil spirits, but from infection. Superstition mixed with medicine in strange ways. Astrologers decided when to perform surgeries, claiming that cutting on the wrong day would anger the stars. Priests recommended pilgrimages instead of remedies, leaving sick kings to travel long, filthy roads in hopes of healing. Even the treatments that seemed helpful were flawed. Honey and vinegar were used to clean wounds, but often applied with dirty cloths. Herbal remedies were brewed in pots, crawling with residue from previous concoctions. And then there were poisons. Royals feared assassination by poison, so doctors prescribed antidotes, mixtures of dozens of ingredients, from crushed gems to snake flesh. These were expensive and foul-tasting, but rarely effective. Ironically, some antidotes contained toxic substances themselves, slowly poisoning the very monarchs they were meant to protect. Despite all of this, medicine was a mark of prestige. Kings and queens flaunted their personal physicians, showing off rare herbs, exotic ingredients, and alchemical potions. But behind the luxury was a grim truth. Their doctors were experimenting blindly, often making illness worse. Imagine a medieval royal bedchamber. A king lies feverish, attended by sweating doctors with blood-stained hands, the air thick with incense and vinegar fumes, while servants carry bowls of leeches and jars of urine-based tonics. This was not healing, it was chaos dressed as science. So while modern medicine saves lives, medieval royal medicine often endangered them. Even the richest rulers could not escape the filth of ignorance, superstition, and unclean practices.
When we think of medieval kings and queens dining, we imagine glittering banquets, long tables piled high with roasted meats, golden goblets of wine, and music filling the hall. And yes, royal feasts were grand, but they were also filthy, chaotic, and often disgusting. Let's start with the food. Royals dined on endless courses of meat: beef, pork, venison, goose, swan, even peacock. Animals were roasted whole, feathers sometimes reattached to make the dish look majestic. But refrigeration did not exist. Meat spoiled quickly, especially in summer. Servants tried to mask the taste with heavy spices, but many dishes were rotten by the time they reached the king's table. The hygiene of kitchens was another nightmare. Castles were smoky, damp, and crawling with vermin. Rats and cockroaches scurried across floors. Butchers worked on wooden blocks, never properly cleaned. Knives were wiped on aprons, not washed. Pigeons flew overhead, dropping filth where bread was baked. Yet these were the meals served to monarchs. Feasts were spectacles of excess. Records describe tables groaning under mountains of food, more than anyone could eat. Leftovers piled up on the floor, where dogs, servants, and beggars fought for scraps.
The air grew thick with the stench of grease, sweat, spilled wine, and waste. Table manners, by modern standards, were shockingly dirty. Guests ate with their hands, wiping fingers on clothes or the tablecloth. Bones and shells were tossed onto the floor. Goblets were shared, passing lips and germs from one person to another. Belching loudly was a sign of appreciation. Entertainment was no cleaner. Between courses, jesters, acrobats, or musicians performed. Some nobles enjoyed crueler diversions, like watching dwarfs fight, animals torn apart, or prisoners humiliated for sport. Feasts were as much about shocking the crowd as they were about food. And then there was drinking. Wine flowed endlessly, often mixed with herbs or honey. Beer and ale were consumed in massive amounts. By night's end, many nobles lay sprawled on benches or vomited into corners. Drunken brawls broke out, sometimes involving knives. The stench of alcohol, vomit, and sweat often lingered long after the feast ended. Sanitation during these events was almost non-existent. With hundreds packed into a hall, chamber pots overflowed. Guests relieved themselves in corners or courtyards. Servants sloshed water across the floors to mask the smell, but it only created filthy puddles underfoot. And yet, despite all this, royal feasts were symbols of power. To display wealth, kings and queens ordered exotic foods: sugar from the East, spices from India, fruits from the Mediterranean. These luxuries dazzled guests, even as the stench of spoiled meat and drunken nobles filled the air. So, while history books describe feasts as glittering affairs, the truth was more grotesque. Picture it clearly. A hall lit by smoky torches, rats scurrying beneath the tables, nobles belching and brawling, dogs gnawing bones, and the king himself raising a greasy hand to toast his court. It was grandeur, yes, but also filth on a royal scale.
Behind the stone walls of medieval castles, beyond the throne rooms and banquet halls, lay the royal bedchamber, a place of power, passion, and often filth. Far from the clean, romantic image we imagine, royal bedrooms were crowded, dirty, and filled with secrets. First, privacy was almost non-existent. A king or queen rarely slept alone. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, and guards were often present in the chamber, even at night. Curtains offered little protection from curious eyes. Whispers of scandal traveled quickly from those who saw or heard too much. The bedding itself was far from fresh. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or feathers that became infested with lice and fleas. Sheets were changed infrequently, sometimes only a few times a year. Sweat, spilled wine, food crumbs, and even bodily fluids soaked into the fabric. The royal bed may have looked impressive with embroidered covers, but beneath the silk was filth. Affairs and scandals only added to the dirt. Kings were notorious for keeping mistresses, sneaking them into chambers through hidden passages. Queens, too, were rumored to take lovers in moments of loneliness. These trysts left the bedrooms not just morally scandalous, but physically unclean. Pregnancy, disease, and political turmoil often followed. Speaking of disease, venereal illnesses were common. With little understanding of sexual health, royals often spread infections within their courts. Treatments were crude, ointments of mercury or herbal pastes that burned the skin but cured nothing. Behind the curtains of the royal bed, power and pleasure often came with painful consequences. Rituals of the bedroom could also be shocking. On wedding nights, noble couples were sometimes watched by witnesses to ensure the marriage was consummated. Imagine the humiliation of a king and queen expected to perform while courtiers lingered nearby. Sheets were inspected for stains, and rumors spread if none were found. Even the simple act of sleep was dirty.
Fireplaces filled rooms with smoke. Chamber pots sat under beds, often spilling during the night. Dogs and cats roamed freely, leaving fleas and droppings behind. Mourning in the royal chamber often meant the stench of sweat, smoke, waste, and spoiled food. Despite this filth, the royal bedroom remained the heart of politics. Alliances were forged there, heirs conceived, and scandals born. The bed was both a throne of intimacy and a stage for power struggles. Behind velvet curtains, secrets shaped kingdoms. So when we imagine a royal bedroom, perfumed, elegant, and pristine, we should think again. The reality was far messier. The royal bedroom was a place of lust and strategy, but also lice, sweat, secrecy, and scandal.
Princes and princesses may sound like they lived in fairy tale comfort, but medieval royal childhoods were anything but clean or safe. From birth to adulthood, young royals grew up surrounded by dirt, danger, and strange practices. Childbirth itself was filthy and risky. Queens gave birth in chambers thick with smoke from incense and herbs meant to purify the air. Midwives used unwashed cloths and dirty hands, often spreading infections. Many royal babies died within days of birth, victims not of curses, but of unsanitary conditions. Those who survived faced constant threats. Cradles were stuffed with straw that harbored lice and fleas. Cloth diapers were rarely changed or properly washed. To soothe crying infants, nurses sometimes rubbed honey or butter on their gums, attracting flies and spreading bacteria. Royal children were often handed to wet nurses, women chosen to breastfeed them. But wet nurses cared for multiple infants, moving between homes with little thought for hygiene. Diseases spread quickly. Yet this was considered normal practice. Superstitions shaped upbringing as much as dirt did. Amulets were tied around babies' necks to ward off evil. Some parents believed bathing weakened infants, so children went unwashed for weeks. Others smeared ash or animal fat on baby skin as a protective charm. The result? Skin infections and rashes were common. Education, too, was less glamorous than imagined. Young princes were taught to ride horses before they could even write. Falls and injuries were frequent. Castles were filled with hard stone floors, open fires, and sharp weapons. Safety was not a priority, and many royal children died from accidents long before adulthood. Food was another hazard. While kings dined on endless meat and wine, children often ate stale bread, watered-down ale, and whatever was available. Fresh milk could spoil quickly, and contaminated water spread disease. Parasites were a constant presence. Even playtime carried risks. Pets like dogs, monkeys, or exotic animals were kept in nurseries, leaving behind droppings and fleas. Toys were crude, sometimes made from bone or lead. What should have been innocent play was often dangerous. Despite these conditions, the upbringing of royal children was considered privileged. They were dressed in silk, taught by tutors, and surrounded by servants. But under the silk lurked lice, and behind the education was a childhood shaped by fear, superstition, and filth. Growing up royal was not a fairy tale. It was surviving dirty chambers, risky superstitions, and constant threats of disease. And yet, these children were expected to grow into rulers, leading nations while never escaping the grime of their earliest years.
When kings and queens went to war, they carried banners of glory, shining armor, and speeches of honor. But the reality of medieval warfare was far filthier than the chronicles suggest.
The battlefield was not just a place of bloodshed, it was a swamp of mud, disease, and unimaginable stench. Marching armies left devastation in their wake. Thousands of men, horses, and wagons churned dirt roads into rivers of mud. Camps sprang up outside cities, vast tent cities filled with smoke, refuse, and human waste. With no proper latrines, soldiers relieved themselves in ditches, fields, or even near water supplies. Disease spread faster than swords. Even royals endured the grime. Kings and princes camped among their armies, sleeping in tents that stank of sweat and damp straw. Their fine armor and silk banners could not shield them from lice, fleas, or contaminated food. Queens who joined their husbands on campaign suffered the same, often falling sick from the filthy conditions. The battlefields themselves were nightmares. After fighting ended, corpses of men and horses lay unburied, rotting in the sun. The stench could be smelled for miles. Flies swarmed, and streams ran red with blood. Survivors trudged through mud mixed with gore, while wounded soldiers screamed in agony. Royal leaders were not immune. Some kings fell sick from plague in their own camps. Others were injured and forced to endure primitive battlefield surgeries, amputations performed with unwashed blades, wounds cauterized with boiling oil. Even a scratch could become fatal when treated with dirty hands. Supplies were another source of filth. Food often spoiled on long marches. Soldiers ate moldy bread, rancid meat, and water tainted with waste. Wine and ale were safer than water, but endless drinking left men staggering into battle drunk. Royals, too, dined on spoiled food, though served on golden plates. And then there was the problem of prisoners. Captured enemies were crammed into dungeons or pits, left to starve or die in their own filth. Sometimes they were paraded before kings, a grim reminder of victory amid the stench of suffering. The glory of war quickly gave way to grim reality. For every shining night, there were hundreds of half-naked soldiers covered in mud. For every royal banner, there were wagons of waste and corpses littering the field. In the end, the filth of war often killed more than the swords. Plague, dysentery, and infection claimed entire armies. Kings and queens who dreamed of conquest often returned not with victory, but with sickness, scars, and the lingering stench of the battlefield. So, while stories tell of heroic battles, the truth was far dirtier. Royalty may have worn crowns and armor, but they marched through mud, blood, and death, like everyone else.
Justice in the Middle Ages was not clean, fair, or merciful. When kings and queens ruled, punishment was not only about law, it was about power, fear, and spectacle. Royal justice was brutal, bloody, and often carried out in the filthiest ways imaginable. Execution was the ultimate tool of authority. Beheadings were common for nobles, but even these honorable deaths were rarely clean. Executioners used dull axes or swords, sometimes needing multiple swings to sever a head. Blood sprayed, soaking the scaffold. Witnesses fainted, vomited, or cheered in the chaos. For commoners, punishments were far worse. Hanging left bodies swinging for days, birds picking at the flesh. Boiling alive was ordered for certain crimes, the condemned thrown into cauldrons of oil or water. Burning at the stake filled towns with the stench of human flesh. These were public events, often attended by kings and queens as a show of royal power. Torture was another filthy weapon of justice. Dungeons beneath castles were dark, damp, and crawling with rats. Chains rusted into prisoners' skin. Devices like the rack stretched bodies until joints snapped. The Iron Maiden, spiked chairs, and red-hot pokers left behind screams and bloodstains that lingered for years.
Royals did not always wield the instruments themselves, but their approval allowed such horrors to continue. And even minor crimes faced humiliating punishments. Offenders were locked in stocks, left in marketplaces as crowds threw rotten food, mud, or dung at them. Whippings filled the air with the smell of sweat and blood. Branding burned flesh, leaving scars of both pain and shame. Sanitation in prisons was non-existent. Prisoners lived among their own waste, sleeping on damp straw. Disease spread quickly, killing many before execution could even be carried out. Yet this suffering was seen as part of justice. Royal courts themselves were often spectacles of corruption. A king might condemn a rival not for guilt, but for political advantage. Queens sometimes used trials to humiliate enemies. The law was not about truth, it was about who held the crown. And all of it, the filth of the dungeon, the screams of the condemned, the stink of the scaffold, was meant to send a message. Disobey the king or queen, and you will not only die, you will die in filth and agony.
In medieval Europe, faith was the heart of royal power. Kings and queens claimed they ruled by divine right, that God himself had chosen them. But the ways in which religion was practiced were often as dirty and superstitious as they were holy. Churches and cathedrals shone with stained glass, incense, and candles, but behind the beauty lay filth. Pilgrims crowded these sacred spaces, coughing, sweating, and carrying lice. They slept on church floors, leaving behind fleas and waste. Relics, bones of saints, drops of holy blood, or even scraps of clothing were handled by unwashed hands and kissed by thousands of lips, spreading disease. Yet these relics were treated as treasures, often guarded by royalty themselves. Monarchs were expected to show devotion, but this devotion was often tangled with dirt and discomfort. Pilgrimages took kings and queens across muddy roads, through towns filled with sewage, and into hostels swarming with bedbugs. Some rulers fasted for weeks, weakening themselves, while others wore hair shirts, rough garments that itched and cut into the skin, leaving sores that became infected. To them, pain and filth meant purity. Confession was another ritual, but the rooms where priests heard sins were dark and airless, often stinking of sweat. The act of kneeling on stone floors for hours left bruises and infections. Yet monarchs endured this to prove their piety. Crusades were another fusion of faith and filth. Kings marched with armies toward the Holy Land, not only for God, but for glory. Along the way, disease spread through camps where thousands shared latrines and water. Corpses lined the roads, and flies swarmed over both the living and the dead. Still, rulers claimed divine favor, even as their soldiers died of dysentery before ever seeing battle. Religious festivals also turned filthy. Feasts meant for honoring God quickly devolved into drunken chaos, with spilled wine, greasy meat, and crowds relieving themselves in alleyways near sacred processions. Yet kings and queens appeared in their finest robes, smiling as if holiness and disorder walked hand in hand. Even burial was steeped in both faith and filth. Monarchs desired to be interred near saints, their bodies placed in crypts that often overflowed with the stench of decay. Tombs were cracked open during renovations, releasing foul odors that reminded everyone that even the most holy were still flesh and bone. So while religion gave monarchs legitimacy and power, it also tied them to rituals that were often far from clean. The cross and crown were bound together, but beneath the glitter of gold and the glow of candles lay lice, disease, and dirt. Faith may have lifted royalty closer to heaven, but the path was always through the mud.
Behind palace walls, royal love was rarely pure. Kings and queens may have married for alliances and power, but passion often found its way into their lives, and with it came scandal, secrecy, and filth.
Royal marriages were not always loving. A king might wed a queen to unite kingdoms, yet spend his nights with mistresses in hidden chambers. Queens, often neglected, sometimes sought comfort in secret affairs of their own. These forbidden loves risked not only scandal, but execution, for adultery in royal circles was seen as treason. Mistresses were common in courts across Europe. Some lived openly in palaces, showered with jewels and gifts. Others were hidden away, sneaking through dark corridors to meet their king. These encounters were far from glamorous. Bedding was rarely clean. Perfumed oils could not mask the stench of unwashed bodies, and secrecy meant hurried meetings in shadowed corners. Lust often left behind evidence. Children born out of wedlock. These illegitimate offspring, sometimes called royal bastards, were both the source of shame and pride. Kings might deny them or raise them into powerful roles, creating entire dynasties of half-royal blood. Queens who bore children outside their marriage, however, faced far harsher consequences. Rumors of infidelity could lead to annulment, exile, or even execution. Affairs brought danger into the royal bedchamber. Jealous rivals poisoned cups of wine or spread rumors to destroy reputations. Some mistresses were accused of witchcraft, their beauty and influence seen as unnatural. The filth of politics mixed with the filth of passion, turning love into a weapon. Even legitimate royal intimacy was far from clean. Bathtubs were rare, perfumes only disguised odors, and chambers swarmed with lice and fleas. Bedding was reused for months, and sheets stained with sweat and more intimate traces were rarely washed. The idea of romance was often more illusion than reality. Yet these dirty loves shaped history. Wars were fought over queens accused of adultery, treaties shattered because of royal mistresses, and dynasties forever altered by forbidden children. Behind every polished portrait of a royal couple lay whispers of desire, betrayal, and scandal. The truth is, medieval royalty may have worn crowns, but they were still human. And like all humans, their hearts strayed, their bodies longed, and their passions often led them into filth and danger.
Few things dazzled visitors to a medieval court more than a royal feast. Long wooden tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, golden pies, sweetmeats, and flowing wine. Kings and queens used these spectacles to show their wealth and power. But behind the glitter of gold platters lay a shocking amount of filth. Banquets were massive events. Dozens of courses were served, from swan and peacock, roasted but with feathers carefully reattached for display, to venison, boar, and even exotic foods brought from faraway lands. Wine flowed like water, and the smell of spices filled the hall. But hygiene was non-existent. Guests ate with their fingers, passing dishes around without washing hands. Grease dripped down beards, sauces stained robes, and bones were tossed to the floor. Forks were rarely used. Knives carved meat, but most food was scooped up by hand or with chunks of bread. Trenchers, flat pieces of stale bread, served as plates. These soaked up juices and were often discarded onto the ground afterward, where dogs or beggars ate them. By the end of the night, the floor of a great hall was covered in scraps, bones, puddles of ale, and worse. Drunkenness was expected. Kings prided themselves on their ability to drink deeply, while nobles competed in toasts. This often led to vomiting right at the table or in corners of the hall. Servants scurried with buckets of water or straw to cover the mess, but the stench lingered. Overindulgence led to gluttony, and gluttony led to sickness. Monarchs often suffered from gout, obesity, and stomach ailments. Meat-heavy diets with little fresh fruit or vegetables meant constipation and digestive problems were common. Doctors prescribed strange cures like boiled herbs or even bloodletting, while the feasts continued night after night. Even the kitchens themselves were far from clean. Fires smoked endlessly, soot clung to walls, and rats scurried across floors. Meat hung for days before cooking, sometimes turning rancid. Spices were used not just for flavor, but to disguise the smell of food already going bad. Servants sweated in the heat, their dirty hands preparing meals for the highest in the land. And yet, despite the mess, these feasts symbolized royal majesty. Visitors judged a king's greatness not by his laws or battles, but by the scale of his banquets. The filth was ignored, the excess celebrated. For a medieval monarch, greasy fingers and wine-stained lips were simply the price of proving one's power. So, while royal banquets shimmer in paintings as elegant affairs, the truth is that medieval feasting was as much about filth as it was about finery. Behind every golden goblet and roasted swan lay sticky tables, stained floors, and stomachs ready to burst.
Even kings and queens, wrapped in silk and crowned with gold, could not escape the filth of death. In the Middle Ages, when a monarch died, the process of preparing their body for burial was as much about spectacle as it was about decay. Embalming was common, but rarely successful. The body was opened, organs removed, and cavities filled with herbs, wine, or vinegar. Yet without true medical knowledge, decomposition often began within hours. The smell of death clung to the air of palaces, forcing courtiers to cover their noses with cloths soaked in perfume. Royal funerals were grand, but behind the velvet and candles lay grim realities. Corpses sometimes blackened, bloated, or leaked fluids inside their coffins. In summer, the heat made the stench unbearable. During long funeral processions, attendants sprinkled flowers and incense just to mask the odor. Some monarchs requested to be buried near saints, hoping holiness would guard their souls. But crypts and tombs were overcrowded, damp, and foul-smelling. Rats and insects thrived among stone coffins. When old graves were disturbed to make space for new burials, the air filled with the choking stench of centuries-old rot. Not all royal bodies were treated with respect. In times of war or rebellion, corpses of kings were dragged through streets, stripped of clothing, or left exposed as warnings. Queens accused of treason sometimes received no burial honors at all, their remains quietly dumped into unmarked graves. Even the most glorious tombs were not immune to filth. Sealed sarcophagi cracked over time, releasing odors when disturbed. Monasteries that guarded royal remains were often infested with mold, dripping water, and swarms of flies. Pilgrims kissed coffins without realizing they pressed their lips to stone, crawling with germs. So while the idea of royal death may conjure images of solemn processions and golden tombs, the truth was far messier. Even crowned heads rotted, and the grave was never clean. In the end, medieval monarchs, no matter how mighty, were reduced to the same filth and dust as the peasants they ruled.
Medieval kings and queens may have had crowns of gold, but when sickness struck, even the mightiest rulers were at the mercy of filthy medicine. Doctors of the time knew little about germs, hygiene, or proper treatment. Their cures were as strange as they were unsanitary, and often more dangerous than the illness itself. Leeches were one of the most common tools of healing. Physicians believed sickness came from bad blood, so they drained their royal patients using jars of writhing leeches.
The slimy creatures left behind bleeding wounds that sometimes became infected. Yet kings endured it, convinced this messy ritual would restore their strength. Bloodletting was not limited to leeches. Sometimes veins were cut directly, spilling royal blood into bowls. Doctors proudly measured how much had been taken, as if weakness and dizziness were proof of healing. Herbal remedies were another favorite. Teas, poultices, and ointments were made from plants, but they were often prepared in filthy conditions. Mortars and pestles were never properly cleaned, and herbs were mixed with unwashed hands. Some medicines included ingredients like powdered bones, dried toads, or even human urine. The line between cure and poison was thin. For stomach troubles, which plagued many monarchs thanks to their heavy feasting, physicians recommended bizarre treatments. A king suffering from indigestion might be given wine mixed with crushed gemstones, or a broth made from animal parts. Queens facing infertility were sometimes told to bathe in animal blood or carry amulets of dried organs. Surgeries were crude and terrifying. Without anesthesia, royal patients were strapped down while barbers, who doubled as surgeons, cut into flesh with unsterilized knives. Wounds were sewn with dirty thread, and infections killed more rulers than the original injuries. Plague brought even filthier practices. Some doctors suggested sitting near open sewers to balance the air. Others burned herbs in royal chambers until the smoke choked everyone inside. Kings and queens wore charms and jewels believed to drive away disease, but no amount of gold could stop the Black Death from sweeping through their courts. Even bathing was sometimes considered dangerous. Physicians warned that hot water opened the pores, allowing sickness to enter the body. As a result, many monarchs avoided washing, relying instead on perfumes and powders to cover their smell, making them sicker in the long run. Despite all this, royal healers were respected and well paid. They spoke in Latin, dressed in fine robes, and impressed courts with their mysterious rituals. But behind the appearance of knowledge was ignorance and filth. Monarchs trusted their lives to cures that often hastened their deaths. So, when we think of medieval medicine, we imagine dark rooms, the stink of blood, bowls of strange potions, and kings groaning as leeches sucked at their skin. The truth is, power could not protect them from pain, infection, or the dirty hands of their own physicians.
When kings and queens led armies into battle, the glory of war was painted in songs and stories. But the truth was far filthier. Medieval warfare was not only about clashing swords and flying banners, it was about mud, blood, and disease that followed rulers and their soldiers everywhere. Royalty often rode at the head of their armies, but even they could not escape the squalor of a military camp. Thousands of men crowded together in tents, sharing food, water, and latrines. Waste piled up, turning fields into cesspools. The stench of sweat, manure, and unwashed bodies clung to the air. Food in the camps was scarce and spoiled quickly. Soldiers gnawed on hard bread filled with insects or drank ale gone sour. Monarchs had better supplies, but even their feasts were tainted by dust, flies, and dirty cooking. Dysentery spread through camps faster than arrows in battle. It was said that more soldiers died from disease than from enemy swords. On the battlefield itself, the filth was unimaginable. Armor trapped sweat and grime, leaving warriors soaked and suffocating. Wounds were not clean cuts, but gashes filled with mud, blood, and splinters. Infections set in almost immediately. The cries of the injured mixed with the buzzing of flies as bodies lay rotting under the sun. Kings who survived battles often brought the scars home with them.
Some were left crippled, their wounds festering for years. Others carried the smell of rot in their bandages, even as they sat back on golden thrones. Sieges were even worse. Monarchs camped outside castles for months, their armies living in filth while trying to starve their enemies into submission. Dead animals were hurled over walls, spreading disease. Wells were poisoned. Inside the castles, people suffered as food ran out. Rats, moldy bread, and filthy water became survival tools. When the gates finally fell, both sides were already half dead from sickness. Even victory was filthy. After battles, fields were littered with corpses. Dogs and scavengers fed on the dead. Survivors looted bodies, stripping off armor and clothing. The ground ran with blood, mud, and waste. Monarchs might ride through in triumph, but the smell of death always followed. For all the songs that praised brave kings and noble knights, the reality was that war left monarchs surrounded by filth. The battlefield was not a stage of glory, but of disease, decay, and suffering. Even crowned heads wrapped in shining armor could not escape the dirt of war. When kings and queens led armies into battle, the glory of war was painted in songs and stories. But the truth was far filthier. Medieval warfare was not only about clashing swords and flying banners, it was about mud, blood, and disease that followed rulers and their soldiers everywhere. Royalty often rode at the head of their armies, but even they could not escape the squalor of a military camp. Thousands of men crowded together in tents, sharing food, water, and latrines. Waste piled up, turning fields into cesspools. The stench of sweat, manure, and unwashed bodies clung to the air. Food in the camps was scarce and spoiled quickly. Soldiers gnawed on hard bread filled with insects or drank ale gone sour. Monarchs had better supplies, but even their feasts were tainted by dust, flies, and dirty cooking. Dysentery spread through camps faster than arrows in battle. It was said that more soldiers died from disease than from enemy swords. On the battlefield itself, the filth was unimaginable. Armor trapped sweat and grime, leaving warriors soaked and suffocating. Wounds were not clean cuts, but gashes filled with mud, blood, and splinters. Infections set in almost immediately. The cries of the injured mixed with the buzzing of flies as bodies lay rotting under the sun. Kings who survived battles often brought the scars home with them. Some were left crippled, their wounds festering for years. Others carried the smell of rot in their bandages, even as they sat back on golden thrones. Sieges were even worse. Monarchs camped outside castles for months, their armies living in filth while trying to starve their enemies into submission. Dead animals were hurled over walls, spreading disease. Wells were poisoned. Inside the castles, people suffered as food ran out. Rats, moldy bread, and filthy water became survival tools. When the gates finally fell, both sides were already half dead from sickness. Even victory was filthy. After battles, fields were littered with corpses. Dogs and scavengers fed on the dead. Survivors looted bodies, stripping off armor and clothing. The ground ran with blood, mud, and waste. Monarchs might ride through in triumph, but the smell of death always followed. For all the songs that praised brave kings and noble knights, the reality was that war left monarchs surrounded by filth. The battlefield was not a stage of glory, but of disease, decay, and suffering. Even crowned heads wrapped in shining armor could not escape the dirt of war.
Life in medieval courts was not all politics, wars, and ceremonies. Kings and queens also sought entertainment.
But the amusements of the Middle Ages were often far from refined. What we imagine as elegant banquets with music and poetry was, in truth, mixed with filth, cruelty, and shocking humor. Jesters were a staple of royal courts. Their role was to make the monarch laugh by any means necessary. They told crude jokes, mimicked nobles, and sometimes performed lewd acts to get a reaction. Cleanliness was not part of the performance. Costumes were rarely washed, and some jesters even smeared themselves with dirt, food, or worse, to provoke laughter. Animal fights were another form of amusement. Bears, dogs, and even lions were brought into courtyards for brutal contests. The ground quickly became soaked with blood, fur, and waste. Monarchs cheered as animals tore each other apart, and the smell of carnage filled the air. Executions were also turned into entertainment. When traitors or criminals were punished, crowds, including kings and queens, gathered to watch. Heads rolled into baskets, bodies swung from gallows, and sometimes victims were burned alive as spectators drank and joked. For medieval royalty, justice and amusement often overlapped in shocking ways. Banquets themselves included filthy amusements. Between courses, dancers and actors performed bawdy plays full of crude humor. Some nobles grew so drunk they staggered across tables, spilling wine and vomiting in corners, while the monarch laughed at the chaos. Feasts often ended in food fights, broken furniture, and floors slick with grease and ale. Even tournaments, those grand events of knights jousting before royalty, had a filthy side. Horses left manure across the fields, bloodied knights collapsed in the mud, and after the cheering ended, servants spent days cleaning up the mess. Monarchs praised chivalry, but they also enjoyed the raw violence of broken bones and splintered lances. Music and dancing filled courts as well, but even these had their dirtier side. Instruments were passed around without care, stained with spit and wine. Dancers sweated in crowded halls, their feet pounding on rush-covered floors littered with food scraps and droppings from animals allowed inside. What we might think of as shocking today was simply part of royal entertainment then. To laugh at filth, to cheer at blood, to drink until collapse, this was the world of medieval fun. For kings and queens, entertainment was not about elegance, but about power, excess, and indulgence. So, while paintings show graceful dances and elegant poetry, the truth is that medieval courts rang just as often with crude jokes, drunken brawls, and the stink of animals and blood. Even in their leisure, royalty lived among filth.
Every royal court sparkled with gold, jewels, and ceremony, but behind the polished surface lay secrets. Medieval monarchs carried with them scandals so dirty, so shameful, that entire kingdoms worked to keep them buried. Whispers spread faster than fire in royal halls. Servants, guards, and mistresses knew the private lives of kings and queens better than anyone, and when secrets slipped, they could shake empires. Affairs were among the dirtiest scandals. Kings flaunted mistresses, but when queens strayed, the entire court buzzed with gossip. Some were accused falsely by rivals, others caught in truth. These scandals risked dynasties, for if a queen bore a child not fathered by the king, the entire royal line could be tainted. Money, too, was a source of scandal. Monarchs taxed their people heavily, yet spent fortunes on jewels, banquets, and wars. Rumors of stolen treasuries and bribery swirled through courts. Greedy advisors were whispered about in taverns, while kings pretended ignorance. Even darker secrets haunted royalty. Murders disguised as accidents, siblings mysteriously vanishing, rivals found poisoned in their beds. Chroniclers recorded the official story, but servants whispered the truth. Royal blood was spilled by royal hands. Scandal was not only political, it was personal.
Some monarchs were mocked for unclean habits, never bathing, sleeping with vermin in their chambers, or drunken rages that left courtiers terrified. Others were accused of sorcery, lust, or blasphemy, rumors that stained reputations long after death. To protect their image, monarchs used spies and informants to silence gossip. Chroniclers were paid to write flattering histories, erasing the dirt from the record. Scandalous letters were burned, troublesome servants exiled, and enemies executed. Still, secrets had a way of surviving, whispered from one generation to the next. What is most shocking is how many scandals were accepted as normal. Affairs, corruption, even murder. So long as the monarch held power, few dared to challenge them. But history remembers. Behind the crowns and portraits, every royal family carried filth in its shadow. The truth is, the story of medieval royalty was not just one of glory and splendor, but of secrets buried beneath layers of dirt. Scandals were the cracks in the golden mask of monarchy, and through those cracks, we glimpse the very human flaws of kings and queens.
The crown glittered with jewels, a symbol of majesty, chosen by God. But for medieval monarchs, that golden circle carried more than glory. It carried filth, of corruption, of suffering, and of the heavy price of power. To wear the crown meant living above others, yet never free from danger. Kings and queens sat on thrones carved with lions and angels, but beneath them were whispers of rebellion, betrayal, and hatred. The very people who bowed in public plotted in private. Poison in a goblet, a dagger in the dark. Royalty lived in constant fear, their crowns resting on uneasy heads. Corruption was woven into the fabric of monarchy. The crown demanded wealth, and wealth meant crushing taxes, endless wars, and bleeding the land dry. Monarchs claimed divine right, but peasants smelled only hunger and injustice. Behind the shine of gold was the dirt of greed. The crown also demanded endless performance. Feasts, parades, ceremonies, all meant to display power. Yet the monarchs themselves were often exhausted, sick, or drunk. Their robes hid sores, their jewels covered debts, and their smiles masked despair. Wearing the crown meant living a lie, a clean mask over a filthy truth. Even the crowns themselves carried filth. Jewels pried from graves, gold melted from stolen treasures, gems traded through bloody wars, all polished and set into symbols of holiness. But every sparkle carried whispers of the dirt from which it came. Perhaps the greatest filth of all was the burden the crown left on the soul. Monarchs ordered executions, condemned innocents, betrayed friends, all to protect their thrones. They wore crowns with pride in public, but in their chambers many wept or raged, knowing the blood on their hands could never be washed away. For peasants, the crown was unreachable. For nobles, it was the ultimate prize. But for those who wore it, the crown was both a blessing and a curse. It promised glory, but delivered fear, filth, and a life forever trapped in power's shadow. The story of medieval royalty is often told in paintings, poems, and legends. We see kings in shining armor, queens in gowns of silk, courts filled with music and light. But beneath the surface, the truth was always dirtier. From filthy feasts to bloody punishments, from unwashed bodies to scandalous affairs, kings and queens lived surrounded by the grime of their age. Their crowns sparkled, yet their palaces stank of sewage. Their laws promised justice, yet their dungeons overflowed with misery. Their prayers rose to heaven, even as their own habits spread disease. This was not weakness, it was reality. In a world without modern medicine, sanitation, or science, even the greatest monarchs could not escape filth. Power could command armies, but it could not stop lice from crawling in a royal bed, or rot from creeping into a king's flesh. And yet, from this filth, history was made. Wars that shaped nations were fought in mud and blood. Dynasties rose and fell on scandals whispered in dirty corridors. Kingdoms were built on the backs of peasants who shoveled waste beneath castle walls. The filth of the Middle Ages was not just background, it was the very stage on which kings and queens lived their dramas. Even today, when we walk through ruined castles or gaze at ancient crowns in museums, we are only seeing the polished fragments of a world once dripping with dirt. The legacy of filth lives on in the myths we tell, the legends we remember, and the fascination we still feel for the dirty, dangerous lives of medieval royalty. So, when we imagine those distant kings and queens, we must strip away the golden glow and look closer. What we find is a history not only of majesty, but of mess, a reminder that even the greatest rulers were still human, still flawed, and still surrounded by filth. The crown glittered, the court shone, but the truth was always dirtier.